Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Nothing like a little bit of sunshine to brighten up some blooms. It's just something about them lighting up and the contrast that a bit of filtered sunlight produces. Sunday morning chat then, and I'm going to sort of loosely title this "What's Going On in My Pot." So I'm immediately excluding the mounts. We won't be talking about those today, or if I do, it'll be in passing. The problem I've got is that if I mention the word nutrients and pH, there's going to be people running for cover, because a hell of a lot of people have definitively stated they've heard enough about it. And to an extent, I agree. I spent an awful long time looking all this stuff up and listening to knowledgeable people to get it in my head. It's in there now. I don't need to keep on reading about it unless somebody comes up with something revolutionary that I haven't heard before. So, you know, I too have probably had enough of it. But this is more about application of some of that knowledge, and as I said, loosely entitled "What's Going On in My Pot?" And I've picked a few pots out. This has got nothing to do basically with the plants that are in them. It's what's going on in the pot. And I'm going to pick on this one first. Now this is a Maxillaria sophronitis. A couple of nice little blooms on, yeah? Now, this is not a deep-rooting plant. By nature, it's a climber and a rambler and a clamberer, you know, so it doesn't need deep roots, like, say, a cymbidium might or something like that. So it's a relatively shallow-rooted thing. So by design, it's in a shallower pot. I needed pot width. I needed the widest pot possible, but I didn't want a deep pot. The problem is if you've got shallow rooting plants and you put them in a deep pot, the bottom half of the pot's not going to have any roots in it and it'll just stay wet. And therein sort of gets on to the subject. Now that's potted in a mix of small bark and sphagnum moss. Yeah. Now the small Orchiata bark breaks down an awful lot faster than the larger grades. Yeah. It's also more tightly compact, which suits this root system. And the idea of adding the sphagnum moss in there was to help it stay moist longer. And if you want to look at workloads, it means you don't have to water it quite so often. But there are consequences, yeah? If you've got an organic media that's shiny new, let's start at that point, okay? So your bark's brand new and your sphagnum moss is straight out of the packet, and you've mixed the two up and you've potted your orchid. And let's say, for example, at that point your media is still bone dry. It's never been watered yet, okay? So what happens when you water that then? Well, first of all, most of the water is going to go straight through and out the bottom of the pot. This are good, we don't want soggy bottoms, yeah? And also what happens when you pour water into the top of a pot and it pours out of the bottom of the pot. What it actually does, if you use a suitable volume, is take all the air with it. And then as it drops out the bottom of the pot, it sucks in new, fresh air with a good oxygen content that might have been getting a bit used up prior to this day one idea. Okay, so we've now wetted our compost for the first time ever, and we know we've got some nice fresh air in all the gaps because that was sucked in by the mechanism of the water filling up the pot and then pouring out the bottom. So that's day one. Now, in our shiny new media with a pot, so I'm not holding that in my left hand for ages, I'll get arm ache. What's going to happen next then? Well, slowly but surely, the media will dry out, yeah? And hopefully we'll get some roots growing as well. But during the time it's wet, moss has got a natural acidity. So if, for instance, the first time this pot was watered, in my case, say it had pure RO water poured into it, that would have had no nutrients in it whatsoever, So the plant hasn't had any feed yet. And it also would have been a neutral pH in my case, which starts at it's around the 7 mark, occasionally 6.9, but it tends to be at 7 straight out of the RO unit. So at that point I've got a nice neutral pH, but the next thing that's going to happen is the moss gets wet, and the sphagnum moss has a natural acidity in it when it's wet. So now my nice neutral pH is starting to head downwards. In this case with the brand new media, not by much. Right, let's wind the calendar on a year. What's that media like now? Well, first of all, the bark will be starting to break down, and it could even be breaking down a fair bit, but nonetheless it's not brand new anymore. So it will have, because it's organic, a natural acidity, as will the moss. So let's say inadvertently I've allowed that pot to dry out completely. Yeah? And then we pour pure water through it again. So I'm not getting into any feed or anything, this is just let's give it a good flush with RO water. What's going to happen this time? Well, I can tell you for sure that the pH of the remaining water in the pot is going to drop a lot more and a lot quicker because of the nature of the media. Right, now that was keeping it simple. Now let's start adding some feed in. And we'll start with the pot a year on, so the media has an element of breaking down going on, and when wetted will produce a drop in the pH naturally because it's that organic media. Now, because I've done all my reading and this, that and the other, I'm going to now mix up some feed for my orchid because it's going to need some. I'm not going into what I feed it with, this, that and the other, but I will touch on one element of feed as I go through. So we've now got a feed level that I would say is okay for that orchid, and again I'm not going into levels, I want to keep this simple. Yeah, so I've got my feed, and on this particular case, let's say that my fertilizer naturally drops the pH a bit, but it doesn't drop it enough. You know, the guidelines always say somewhere between 5.5 and 6.5 is good for orchids. Well, you know, the higher end is better for some, and the lower end is better for some. But nonetheless, you know, somewhere in there. So let's say I've adjusted my pH, including my fertilizer, down to 6.5. Now what happens when I pour my feed into that pot? Bearing in mind, if it was pure water, the natural acidity in the pot would have dropped my pH quite a bit. Think it through. This is where you start needing to have a bit of thinking going on, because if you, because of the knowledge you have, adjust your pH down to a suitable level. Let's say, for instance, on this particular watering, because the idea of swinging the pH from high to low I still agree with, I've got no qualms about that, but let's say I was doing one of my low pH feeds and I'd taken my water down to a pH of 5.8. What the hell's going to happen to that when I pour it in the pot? Got it? It's going to drop. Whatever you do, it's going to drop. The acidity of the media is going to drop that pH down. So if you start at quite a low pH, it's going to go even lower. And it could be dropping out, excuse me, of the bottom of the recommended range and would end up being far too acidic. And you have to bear in mind that your nutrients are absorbed best at certain pHs. And again, I'm not going to go into it. But if you start with a pH climbing up towards the 7 or even above the 7, quite a few nutrients will be excluded or greatly reduced. Yeah? The same happens if you go the other way. If you start getting too acidic, you'll start excluding certain nutrients. So your nice balanced fertilizer suddenly isn't working as well as it ought to be, and your plants could suffer as a consequence. So that's in simplistic terms. Right, let's take another pot. What's in my pot? Right, this is a relatively new acquisition. Nice little cattleya with some pretty little blooms on, and more to come. Doesn't matter what it is, it's a cattleya type. And that's potted in a holy clay pot, and it's got large Orchiata bark in it. And it hasn't been in there that long. Now the first thing I'll say about the larger grades Orchiata bark is they're a bit of a pain in the arse to try and get wet for some time. And depending on how frequently you were watering, it can actually take a month or more before it starts wetting properly. You know, so your frequency of watering on a wet-dry cycle would need to be a lot higher at first with that type of bark. And that may apply to other types of bark as well, I don't know. I only use the Orchiata at the moment, and I'll add in at the moment. So what's happening in that pot then? Let's start on the day one principle again. I've just potted it up. It's got brand new Orchiata bark in it. It's a holy clay pot. And that particular pot in question is very, very hard clay. It doesn't actually hold a lot of moisture, so it doesn't absorb much. Some of the other ones I've got are not in that vein. Some of them are quite soft clay, and they really suck the moisture away from the edge of the media, which in some cases might be good, in others that is not so good. So anyway, day one, nice shiny new Orchiata bark, and it's dry. So I'm going to pour copious amounts of water through that, nice clean RO water. What's going to happen in the pot? Well, first of all, it's going to dry pretty quick. And the second answer is nothing's going to happen in the pot. Basically, the Orchiata bark in those stages is going to have so little effect on pH that you don't even need to worry about it. So far so good. What's going to happen if the next time I water it, I add some feed in? Yeah? Well, again, the Orchiata bark is so hard it doesn't absorb much when it's new, so most of what I pour in is going to go straight through and pour out the bottom. So I'm now pouring my fertiliser down the sink. Hopefully the roots will grab hold of some of it on the way through. But this pot is going to get a wet-dry cycle because it's a cattleya. And the length of time it stays dry in between the waterings, for me, will depend on the time of year. And in the lower temperatures, that dry bit will be a bit longer than in the higher temperatures of the growing season, when they don't stay dry for that long at all. But they still get that cycle, even if it's just daily. Right, let's roll that pot on a year then. What's going to have happened to that Orchiata bark in a year? In this case, with the large grade, not a lot. It's not going to be breaking down much yet, but nonetheless there would probably be a little bit of acidity built up in any residual moisture left in that pot. How much residual moisture is left in that type of pot? The answer is not a lot. So would I worry about the effect of my pH in a pot like that? And the answer is no. I wouldn't need to. So when I'm doing my low pH feed down near the 5.8, 5.9 mark, it's not going to drop enough for me to worry about in that type of pot, in that type of media. The only thing you've got to watch with clay pots is because they do absorb some of the moisture, they also can hold on to it. So if you're using high levels of feed on a frequent basis, the pot's going to grab some of that and keep it. And if your roots are trying to attach to that pot, they're probably going to fail because there's a high salt content in the clay, and that really needs to be avoided. Now I feed at quite low levels. I do feed frequently though. So I make sure when I flush my clay pots, they really get flushed. And not only the media, the pot gets absolutely drowned as well. So that hopefully any build-up of salts in the clay is leached out during that flushing process. I probably don't get it all, but I'm going to get a lot of it. So that's that pot. Right, let's have a look at another one then. And this is one of my Miltonias. Relatively recently repotted, but this is in a mix of the small and the medium Orchiata bark, and it has got some sphagnum moss mixed into it. Yeah, the idea being that it doesn't dry out too quickly and it stays moist for a reasonable amount of time. But nonetheless, I do err on the side of caution with these because they do not like a soggy mix. The roots will rot pretty quickly. So you need a nice buoyant mix, fresh media, and the ability to start drying relatively quickly, but not ridiculously quickly. That's why I added the moss. Now, while I'm on the subject of this sphagnum moss, this latest lot of moss that I've had, I'm not sure the sterilisation process works as well as perhaps it once did. Because in theory, the moss you get is dead. There's some sort of treatment, whether it's heat treatment, that kills everything in it and the moss itself. So just because you've got it wet, it shouldn't grow, ever. Well, I got a feeling recently that this moss is actually coming back to life, zombie moss. Now, it may be my imagination, and that could be just an algae development on the moss, but I am getting quite a lot more green in the pots that have got the sphagnum moss in over the recent year or so. Anyway, back to the pot. When this was first potted up, back to this day one principle again, and I poured water through it, nothing much would have happened. In a year's time, both the moss and the small grade Orchiata bark in there will be starting to turn a little acidic. So with this orchid, flushing is of paramount importance. Yeah, you mess these roots up and they start to die back. They're a bit of a nuisance to try and recreate, and your plant will go downhill as fast as anything. That's just Miltoniopsis. But nonetheless, I'm aware that in this pot, after a period of time, there will be some acidity which this plant does not like. So does this plant ever get watered with a low pH feed? No, never. It only ever gets a feed at the high end of the recommended pH level because it's going to drop a bit in the pot, and I don't want it dropping off the bottom end and becoming very acidic on delicate little roots like this. So that one just needs a little bit of caution, and quite honestly that comes in with my cooler growers, Masdevallias, Restrepias, Draculas, a couple of others, and as a consequence virtually all of those plants should not dry out at all, and if they do, only for the very shortest amount of time. So the media is going to stay wet most of the time, so it will break down quicker. And even with a flush, if I pour gallons of water through that in a year's time, I will flush out the acidity, and probably within a day it will be back, because the media has that acidity inherent within it. Yeah, so that only ever gets a feed at the high pH end, so that when it drops down in the pot it still stays in the range I want it to be in. Right, last one, and this is another one of the cooler growers. This is a Restrepia. Now, generally speaking, Restrepias are quite shallow rooted. But they do produce roots. They don't just sit there growing on nothing. Now this one's been in this pot quite a long time, hence the massive extended root system that I've got in there. But the media is probably in the process of breaking down. It's not got to the mushroom stage or anything yet. This has decided to have a massive burst of blooms at the moment. After the heat stopped and the more sensible temperatures started, I could hear plants like this going, whoopee, back to normal again. And it really is having a burst at the moment, which is nice. Delicate little blooms, very pretty. But anyway, this pot, and it's getting heavy already, is in a media that's already in the process of breaking down. It's far from gone. It's not in need of a desperate repot or anything, but it will probably get done at the start of next year before it gets too warm, to give those roots a chance to re-establish before it gets into the warmer season. Let it get a hold. But again, as a consequence, it's a cool grower, needs to stay moist. So again, it never gets a low pH feed, ever. Basically it gets the top of the range pH feed, because I know as soon as that moisture gets in the pot there will be a reaction with the media that will lower the ambient pH of the moisture left in the pot. So it's worth having a think about what your plants are potted in. Now if you grow in a media which will include bare rooted and in the main mounts with very, very little moss on them, because they're virtually bare rooted, aren't they? You don't really need to worry about this so much. It's just not really going to be a problem. Even though when I water a mount, the mount stays wet for a while, it doesn't stay wet for long. And it's not exactly dissolving the mount, is it? I mean, in 10 years it might. But yeah, so it's not so much of a problem. But when you've got pots, if you've got an inorganic media, there are two types. There are those that don't absorb water, the likes of stones, your river rocks, pebbles, gravel, that sort of stuff. It gets wet, but it doesn't really absorb anything. Yeah, so it's not going to get any build-up of nutrients or anything inside the media. And if you flush it, you've probably just done the best flush in the world, because whatever's in the pot's now gone straight out the bottom. Brilliant. But if you start getting into the sort of inorganic media that can hold water and absorb water, that's things like lava rock, leca, ceramis, if that stuff's still doing the rounds, that sort of thing, then it will hold moisture. And in that moisture is your feed. And then we'll just get on to touching just gently on the types of nitrogen. Now, there's a lot of stuff written about this, especially, it's not dedicated to orchids, it's the problem. People are making assumptions because of the way we grow our orchids rather than stating flipping facts. 3 types of nitrogen. You've got the urea type. Now that was developed for agricultural use. It's dirt cheap, yeah? And you can use it for irrigation in all sorts of farming applications and stuff like that. And the most important thing to remember is when that type of irrigation takes place, it takes place in soil. We don't tend to grow our orchids in soil, yeah? And what happens to that urea nitrogen when it gets in the soil? The little microorganisms get at it and they turn it into a form of ammonia type nitrogen. And then they keep getting at it and eventually it'll become nitrate type nitrogen, which is generally accepted is much better for orchids because it's absorbed readily at all temperatures. Now, snap back to your orchids, yeah? The urea and the ammonium type nitrogen needs to have that organic process taking place on it to turn it to nitrate. Now, some people still say that urea nitrogen can be absorbed by the plants and used, and an awful lot say it can't without that conversion process. So the conversion process is going to take place in the media around the roots, and it needs those microorganisms. How many of those do you think you've got in your river rock? You don't need an answer. How many of those might be in some of my pots, like with the small grade Orchiata and the sphagnum moss? Well, chances are there could be nice little colonies in there. But every now and again, I use a pesticide. And even if I don't use it to water the whole pot, it's still going to run down off the leaves and the canes and pseudobulbs into the pot, and that's going to wipe them out. And then you've got to think, well, if you wipe them out, how do they get back there then? Can they get back there then? Yeah? So if they're there in the first place, where did they come from? Because the bark and the moss was sterilised. So the chances are that these colonies of microorganisms in your orchid pot are a bit thin on the ground. So they're not going to do that job efficiently. And then the vital fact is that those microorganisms virtually stop breeding and become virtually dormant below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And the colder it gets, you're heading towards them doing next to nothing. Yeah? So you make your decision on what type of nitrogen you think you ought to be using on your orchids. You should come up with a sensible answer. You don't need me to tell you. And a mixture is not a bad idea. you know, I mean, it's some of our orchid pots might have some of these colonies. So, you know, a mix of nitrate and ammonium types. A lot of fertilizers now lump urea and ammonium type nitrogen together. They just lump them together. But the nitrate will always be separated out. And I would always err on the side of caution and make sure that the nitrate type nitrogen is the higher value rather than the lower value. And that way you know that that nitrogen's readily available straight away without any interaction with anything else in the pot. Take a deep breath. Need a coffee now. So yeah, have a think about your pot. Think about the media that's in it and the effect it has on your carefully controlled water and feed that you're pouring in there. And your water and your feed that you're pouring in there might not be having the desired effect depending on what's in your pot. And it is worth giving it a thought. Yeah. Mainly for those who are using the organic media, which I do. I mean, strictly speaking, even a mount is a form of organic media because it's going to have a bit of moss on it. Yeah. And the bark itself is organic. It's real bark. It once was hanging off the side of a tree somewhere, you know, until somebody brutally stripped it off. Yeah, so yeah, it's worth a thought. Sphagnum moss is generally accepted as being quite acidic. And the longer it stays wet, the more that acidity would build up. Yeah. And likewise with small grade bark, that's going to break down faster, so that will have an inherent acidity in the pot. Mix the two together, can virtually guarantee. If you want to do a test, it's not that difficult to do. Give a pot a really good water with clean water, and then leave it for a few hours or half a day, something like that, and then get some more clean water in a container and stand the pot in it and leave it there for about an hour. And then test the water in the container. Give the pot a swirl round every now and again to make sure the water's distributed through the media, back out into your container, give it a good stir around and test it again. And if your media's old, you're going to get a hell of a drop in a pH value just in that short period of time. If your media's relatively fresh, there might not be much of a change. But it is worth considering when you start very carefully measuring the pH of the feed that you're pouring in your pot. Because you might find what's in your pot is dramatically changing it to something that is less desirable. It's all very well saying, you know, oh, this time I'm watering with the high-end pH so that those nutrients get in. And after a couple of hours in that older media, you've lost that higher pH. So unless those orchid roots grabbed hold of it pretty damn quick, they've lost the ability to be able to get at those nutrients at the higher pH end. And if you were at the other end, you could be heading into a danger zone, you know, whereby if you start going much lower than 5.8, 5.9, heading down to say what is the minimum recommended value of 5.5, and then apply that to your older organic media, you could be dropping down below 5 into the 4s, you know, which is like vinegar. So take care. Yeah. And anybody who bailed out at the beginning when I mentioned the word nutrients and pH, well, you missed out. Tough. Anyway, conversation point, that's all it's supposed to be. I'm not saying what anybody should or shouldn't do with nutrients or pH, quite honestly. There's plenty of reading matter out there. You can all make your own minds up. But a bit of guidance is not bad now and again. Not you must do this, not anything other than this is what I do and why. And that's all you'll ever get from me is, well, what I would do is this. And that's based on a number of years and, you know, keeping track of what goes on in my grow room with my orchids. And therein lies another thing. Remember that some advice is geared up to exactly that. My orchids in my grow room. And that advice might not work for you growing outside in Florida. Yeah? Or in an apartment in Canada. Yeah? So the environment has an effect as well. Anyway, I've waffled on enough and my throat's getting dry. More coffee required. See you next time. Oh, just a hint. Tomorrow's video was filmed yesterday. So if you're watching this today, that's of value. If it's already tomorrow, that's all wrong. But I filmed the this thing. Yeah. I filmed hacking that to bits in the kitchen and the logic behind what I was doing and everything, and that'll be tomorrow morning's video. It's already filmed, it's ready to go, and I was almost going to post it today, and then I thought, well, it's become a bit of a tradition to do this Sunday morning chat thing, so I thought I'll waffle away for a bit and then I'll post that one tomorrow. So you get a kitchen session tomorrow. A little bit unusual. Still, see you tomorrow then, or next time, or whenever. Bye for now.